Hey everybody, welcome to the North Carolina Real Estate Show. I'm your host, Tiffany Weber. I'm an attorney at Thomas & Weber in Mooresville, North Carolina, and today I am joined by Erin Weatherman, who is also an attorney. So if you listened to the last episode, then you heard Erin and I breaking down the North Carolina offer to purchase. So we are going to continue doing that. We are going to start at Section 4, Paragraph 4 of the offer to purchase, again, Standard Form 2T, the July 2022 version. Erin, kick us off. Let's talk about the buyer's due diligence process.
So there's a lot included in the buyer's due diligence process. So this is the part where a buyer should confirm that they're qualified for their loan if they're getting a loan. That's important. And then this is where you investigate or inspect the property. So you put on your little detective hat.
I love this. I'm seeing like the emoji with the spectacles.
Yes. Pull out your magnifying glass and you search around. So you're going to inspect the whole property. This is also where you look at documents. So you really should do that before you make an offer on a property, but this is where you review covenants and restrictions and make sure there is no restriction on your intended use of the property.
Can we talk a little bit more about why you should look at restrictions before you put an offer in? You know, like if you want a property that you want to be able to run your bakery business out of.
Yep.
You got to make sure that there's no restrictions against commercial use of the property. And so agents, this is so critical. So one, it helps make your search more efficient and you're not wasting time at showings of properties that aren't going to fit their needs.
Yeah.
But then you don't end up with buyers under contract to buy a property and they lose their due diligence because they have to cancel.
Yeah.
So if you don't know how to find restrictions, that is a skill that you, I would say need. It's not even it'd be nice to have. That's a must-have skill.
Yeah. This is also surveys. Surveys, so important. Brought to you by surveys. Surveys really tell you the property lines, and while you think you know the property lines, that's fine. But until somebody encroaches on your property.
She said it's fine. What she means is you don't.
Yeah. You don't. Who owns that fence on your land? Is it the neighbor? Is it you? Is it on your land or is it on your neighbor's land? This is also where you investigate zoning, and if you live in a flood zone, your access to the property and all of the streets and roads.
These are the things that some of them the attorney will do, some of them the buyer and their agent will undertake. So like the attorney, we don't order the surveys. We think you should have one.
Yeah.
I don't know an attorney that will ever say, don't get a survey. There might be scenarios where they say, if you're not going to get a survey, this situation I'm more comfortable in. For example, a newly platted development. No one's ever lived there. The house was just built or has not been built yet. So like newly platted development and you're buying a vacant lot. Even then, the attorney still probably isn't going to say you don't need a survey.
Yeah.
So yes, there are times where there may be a higher level of comfort with not getting a survey, but from the attorney's perspective, you need a survey. No one can tell you where the property lines are without a survey. Now, I want to talk also a little bit about the loan.
Yeah.
That was the first thing you talked about, of making sure that you can get qualified for a loan. This contract, from its default state, if you don't qualify for the loan, so what? I mean, from the perspective of this contract, you're still under contract to buy that property, whether you can get a loan or not.
Mm-hmm.
So keeping in mind, if you have questions about your ability to qualify for a loan, you need to think very carefully about how much non-refundable money you put up.
Yep.
Because if you can't buy the house without a loan and you put up all your cash in the due diligence fee and then you don't qualify and you have to terminate, that's gone.
Yep.
You're not getting it back unless some seller takes mercy upon you. And
yes.
why would they? You know, at that point, they're thinking you knew what you were getting into here.
Yeah.
So unless there is some special attorney drafted addendum to make the offer to purchase contingent upon qualification for a loan, you got to buy the house. I mean, you can always back out, but you're still under contract is what I should say. You're still under contract to buy the house even if you cannot qualify for a loan until you terminate. Now, moving on, in the due diligence, this is also talking about, kind of like how the contract is not contingent upon your approval for a loan. It's also not contingent upon you being able to sell or rent out your existing property. So if you have a house that you own and you're trying to buy a new house, so what if you can't sell the other house? If you go under contract to buy the new house, just the fact that you can't sell your other house does not prevent you from being under contract for the new house. Again, unless there is some attorney-drafted addendum to make the contract contingent upon the sale or lease of existing property. That's something that I have seen agents try to do in the contract. There's no longer a standard form for this. So I've seen recently even agents writing in, the due diligence date or the closing date, 60 days from closing on property at blah, blah, blah. Their intent was to make the contract contingent on the closing of blah, blah, blah address. That's not what they did. It just means that's when it's closing. Doesn't, it causes all sorts of issues. So I can't even begin to count the ways that would make the contract very hard to be enforced on either side. It really muddies up what the parties' responsibilities are. So knowing that you cannot make the contract contingent upon loan approval or the sale of other property within the four corners of this standard form, you need to contact an attorney to draft an addendum. If you're trying to draft something that you're like, how would I make this stick legally? You're not supposed to be drafting that.
Ask a lawyer.
The lawyer's supposed to be drafting that. Now, talk to me a little bit about this next part of the due diligence, the repair section.
So this is basically after your inspection comes back. I've never seen such a good inspection that the inspector said, it's perfect.
Nope.
When your inspection comes back and you get those things like, oh, there's a bat in the attic. True story. Or there's a little crack on the side of the house. Or anything like that, this is where you then call up the sellers and say, hey, can you maybe do some things before I move in? Like maybe get the bats out? So this is where you request the seller to do certain repairs or certain things like remove bats.
And request is the operative word here.
Yes.
Because
seller doesn't have to.
Unless you agree otherwise, meaning it's in writing.
Yep.
Not you talked on the driveway after the showing, or when you were driving by you saw the seller and they said, oh yeah, we'll fix that. If they didn't write it down, you didn't write it down, and y'all didn't sign it, y'all didn't agree.
Yeah.
So unless the parties agree otherwise, the house is being sold as is. So you can make the request to the seller. The seller does not have to agree. And here's the thing. The seller's failure to agree to the repair request is not a breach of contract.
Yep.
Buyers will get calls and emails saying, we have an issue with, the inspector found this. And I said, seller, you need to fix it. And they said, no, I want my due diligence fee back. That's not a breach of contract.
Yeah.
There's, I don't want to get too far into the exception being if the seller represented that there was some, this is exclusive of a misrepresentation issue. Let's assume that there was no misrepresentation occurring.
Yeah.
So lacking misrepresentation or absent misrepresentation, if the seller just says, no, I'm not going to replace that squeaky door.
Yeah.
That's not a breach. So, you make the request.
Yeah.
And if the seller agrees, then those things have to be agreed upon in writing. And that's in addition to the contract. And it's going to be on most often it's on that standard form, the due diligence repair request. And that's where all of those things need to be addressed in that document. Let's talk about what if during the inspection the buyer breaks something.
Oh, well, oops. But you got to fix it.
Yeah.
So that is part of your job, that if you are inspecting the property and you break something, I don't want to sound like a store, but you break it, you buy it. Mm-hmm. And so you have to fix that for the seller. If you break a lamp, you're paying for that lamp. But if you hurt the outside of the home in your inspections, then you got to account for that too, and you've got to make it up to the seller.
Mm-hmm. And I like the way that you said you break it, you buy it, because that's true in two different ways. One, you got to fix the problem.
Mm-hmm.
If you tear the door off its hinges, you got to put it back on to the way that it was. We're not saying you have to make it, you got to restore it to the way it was, not necessarily like Taj Mahal or whatever. But then also, if you're on the property doing some inspections and you get hurt, or you bring dad along, because every buyer wants to bring their dad. It just is what it is. They bring their dad, and dad acts as a secondary inspector. And dad trips and falls, and he hurts himself. Provided that wasn't due to the seller's negligence or something bad that the seller did, then the buyer's going to have to indemnify the seller out of any claim.
Yep.
So, if dad gets hurt on the property, the seller didn't do anything wrong, well, buyer's got to indemnify seller.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like a basic example. It could get very complicated, but basically, if you as the buyer are the reason something goes sideways on the property, you're going to be financially responsible for it. So either to fix it or to pay for it.
Yeah.
Continue on with this. Tell us about the buyer's right to terminate.
Okay, so we talked about this a little in our last episode, that the contract isn't necessarily skewed towards the buyer, but purchasing is kind of skewed towards the buyer. And so seller can't terminate the contract unless there's been some form of breach on buyer's part. Buyer has the right to terminate the contract really any time.
Mm-hmm. For any reason or no reason.
Absolutely. And so whether you get your money back, that's a different question. But do you have the right to terminate? Absolutely.
Now, the last part of this section is, if you close, you're accepting the property in the condition that it's currently in at the time of closing, unless otherwise agreed in writing. So you could have an addendum drafted or an amendment to the contract drafted that says we'll close, but the seller still has to do X, Y, Z. Those can sometimes be hard to enforce, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. But the default is, at closing, whatever condition the property is in, you are accepting it. That is why it's so important. If you had repairs agreed to, you need to go back and do your walkthrough.
Yes.
And then also, the seller does have an obligation to make sure the property is in the same or better condition as it was when you went under contract. So they can't just lay waste to the property. But that's why the walkthrough is so important, is to make sure that you're satisfied with the condition of the property. Mm-hmm. If you don't go and check to make sure the repairs were done to your specifications, you accepted it. So, again, there's always the potential that you have agreed something in writing so that it can defer past the closing date. But absent that agreement, you have to make sure that the property is in the condition that you want it to be in at the time of closing.
Yeah.
So I feel like that is a good place to stop for this episode. So we will continue on in our next episode we'll just continue on talking about the rest of the contract. But for now, thank you for listening to the North Carolina Real Estate Show. See you in the next one.